In the 50s, all comic books were almost, wiped out thanks to seduction of the innocent. Even though they really made up the rules for the comic code authority, to really go after the EC comics, but it affected, all the comics. It really hurt them. And then in the 70s, what a lot of people don't know is Marvel almost went out of business, and it was thanks to getting licensing to do comics about, movies and TV shows and things like that. That kind of saved them. In the 80s, Marvel almost got the rights to put out DC Comics. I don't talk a lot much about that because I just heard about that a few years ago, but that's one of the ways that John Byrne ended up getting on Superman and revamping him for his 50th anniversary. He already had pages that I think he used in Man of Steel #1 or maybe Superman #1 that he was already getting ready to hand Jim Shooter so he could get on Superman while he was doing Fantastic Four. Before that, we had the in the late 70s we had the DC implosion. Jeanette Kahn had come on. She had two magazines, Pizzazz and something else that were huge. So they brought her in and she expanded the line of, and we had the DC explosions and of comics, and the stories were kind of thin and spread out, but we had two blizzards in a row and people couldn't get out, and when they did get out they didn't go buy comic books. They went and got freaking food and got back in the house, so that hurt the sales, and so the market kind of crashed a little bit because of that, but they didn't fire. And Jeanette Kahn had this whole thing about it's creative, these are artists and stuff, so let them create, and she kind of championed that from the late 70s to the early 2000s. And now that we got stuff like Watchmen, Neil Gaiman, Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller, all kinds of things, that let DC kind of, experiment and everything like that. And, and then you also got to remember, the 90s was a rough time, and when the bubble popped in, Marvel filed, bankruptcy. Chapter 11 bankruptcy, protection, whatever. And they came out of it. So when the news hit through Bleeding Cool, a site that's I've always kind of considered the Inquirer of movies, television, and comics and stuff, because they print rumors and stuff. I put them right up there with Box.com, who's come after me before and stuff like that. But I saw one or two other little articles pop up, and it pretty much said the same thing. DC's had a deficit. Sales are down. They've got maybe one or two comics that hit the top 20, and they supposedly lost $2 million. And my first reaction was like, big deal, big surprise. It's almost like, yeah, hearing this again, whatever. They moved to Burbank. They put out Convergence just as filler so they could get the company moved from New York and to California and stuff. It's all because of the movies and stuff. You could tell I'm kind of dismissive, like it wasn't a big deal. And then I finally got home. And sat down and decided to really go through this stuff, and I saw video. Jim Lee and Dan Didio did videos, interviews for the LA Times. You can go to Bleeding Cool and find it. You can probably do a Google search and see some of those other things. I mean, I'm really, just giving you, a real Reader's Digest version here of what I'm talking about. So, but basically DC's supposed plan is DC 52 failed. And if you can go back in my videos when they had the promotional the promotional little book come out announcing all 52 titles, I was taking a knife and I was stabbing all the books that I thought wouldn't make it and everything like that. And pretty sure I ended up being right. It's upstairs somewhere, but I didn't feel like digging it out. And then they come out with this big DCU where we're not going to worry about continuity, and we're going to let people take characters in different directions and stuff like that. And I'm just like, what are they doing? And and then I saw that video interview with the LA Times that they did, and I was just like, oh my God, have the people whose one job is to create comics and be creative, can they not come up with better creativity with their bullshit? Because any kid who watched fairy tale theater in the 80s or had a storybook in the house has probably heard the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. For the first time, I was just like, these people are full of shit. I don't know why. It's not a personal slam. It's not anything like that. It's just I'm hearing this and I'm like, are you nuts? Now let me give you what my approach is. I'm not going to pretend that I know what really goes on behind the scenes to keep, a comic book company going. Okay, I remember when Joe Quesada took over and stuff. He said that if we'd gone with what some of the fans wanted to do with, our comics, that they would have went out of business. And other little things like that we probably couldn't imagine. Okay, great, fine. But what happens is the people that make the big decisions, we'll call them the suits, are making these decisions, getting the comics. That's what hurt Marvel. It was probably the final nail in the coffin. They gave us Marvel Edge, the Marvel Spider-Man universe. They split their Marvel universe up into little categories and stuff. It wasn't a creative decision. And then again, you had Jeanette Kahn, who was letting DC, bring in the artists, let them be artists, let them be writers and stuff. With boundaries and stuff. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't like a free for all, but she heard a good idea. She had the instincts with Dick Giordano to say go. And that's just what gets so. When the suits make the decisions, it's the people on the front lines who are making the comics who are the ones taking the beatings from us. I'm trying to remember who the artist was, or the writer was. Maybe it was Paul Jenkins or somebody like that. Around Secret Invasion, they brought back Captain Marvel, and he was hired to write a story. He was told by the suits editors, write a story where Captain Marvel comes back, and he took a beating. He was just a hired gun who got paid to write a story. And that's why I don't like going after creators. That's why I don't like really putting down books. But when the DC 52 came out, it made really no sense at the time. And I was a little bit vocal about it. MA0001 was more vocal. A lot of people were more vocal and stuff. I was kind of optimistic. I'm tired. I was more tired. I was more indifferent. Like, I've seen these revamps. So, Crisis on Infinite Earths and then Zero Hour and on and on and on and all this stuff. But at this point in time, it seems like Dan Didio had a plan that I was all right with. You had Identity Crisis, and then you had Infinite Crisis, then you had Final Crisis, and then by the time they got to The Blackest Night, I'm like, they got their shit together. These books were really good. DC has been home of the icons. That's the whole thing, the icons. And at the same time, DC had this, it finally was going to court. Some stuff was going on congruently. We had, the Siegel and Schuster estates, going and finally making it to where they could really be heard about Superman and ownership and money coming back to him and stuff. And Superboy got dragged into it. It affected the comics. And that's going to be a point I make in a minute, man. We started hearing more and more thanks to the internet and whatever about all these things that were going on. And then Superboy got killed, and everybody speculated, oh, it's probably because of the courts and stuff. Like, oh, no, that has nothing to do with it. And then as soon as, it was over with, they brought Superboy back, and they found out that thing called, they were not, Schuster, they were not owing any money because of, it was a derivative of Superman, not Superman. And I also heard that they did have to go back and pay some for Superboy. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is that led to there is a legal loophole that Marvel and DC is both using, and I'm convinced, not conspiracy, convinced that that's really what the DC 52 is. All the heroes that came out were really derivatives of the originals. Things were tweaked, things were changed. And that what that means is that creators and people who probably had contracts and a few other things that were going on, DC didn't have to pay them anymore because these are derivatives. That's why everybody was wearing armor. That's why subtle little changes were made. When you get in there and you see how they really changed the characters, that's why some books just went on. Like Green Lantern didn't even feel like it had changed through the 52, except in storytelling. And then, Batman, nobody knew what to make of it. Supposedly they've been around for 5 years, and there's 3 Robins, and there's this, and there's that going on. It's not really a Bat family anymore, even though they're trying to say it is. And that's the thing that kept getting me. They were telling us, yeah, the continuity's messed up, and we hurried up and did this, and they maybe had 6 months to do it. Not very well planned to start a whole new universe, and we're going to give you diversity, and we're bringing up all these characters and stuff. And really, we're going to bring up some of our more popular characters that we're not really having to pay anybody too much that made these characters. And nobody bought them. After everybody was yelling diversity in comics, and they wanted this and they wanted that, nothing sold. Part of that was because the stories were bland and thin, much like a lot of the books that came out in the late 70s from DC. And then I think, in my opinion, a couple of things happened. This DC 52 revamp, they've been wanting to create a whole new audience And that's what they say in the L.A. Times videos that you can find on Bleeding Cool News. I'm like, there's this thing about, yeah, you need new people to come in, and you've had a lot of people in their 40s and 50s now who have supported comics for a long time, and that's part of the reason you still have a company. You have loyalty, and then but with the DC 52, it was like somebody was spinning their mustache and just being just a bad guy. Like, these you're not going to recognize anything anymore. And I think that was purpose. I think that was purposely because as people who had been with DC, Marvel, collecting comics for a long time, I think what was going to happen is that they were afraid there was going to be poison in the minds of the younger people that were coming in when we started explaining why this sucks and this was better and that was better in the past and all this knowledge that we actually had. I think they were afraid it was going to be, counterproductive. I actually read an article about one of the ways to get into comics and stuff is that they want people who are young or look young, so that when kids go to these conventions and they have Marvel and DC let these guys go to the conventions, these kids don't get freaked out by seeing old men. I don't know if that's a thing or not. And now, since we're talking about creators and stuff, where did the DC 52 mess up? You know, Basically people really do want creators who stay on a book for a while. They want their books to go longer than a year, 8 issues, whatever, and not have a lot of changes that completely change the tone of the books and stuff. Greg Rook on Wonder Woman. I read a few issues. It was one of the better DC 52 titles. I didn't agree with what they did to the New Gods in it after I gave it a chance, but I wasn't harking on it. Greg Rucka pulled off the book, quit, whatever. People complain. George Perez, they would not give him any information so he could write a better Superman story. He didn't know about Ma and Pa Kent, are they alive or not, and all this stuff. They wouldn't tell him anything. He gets out of there, man. George Perez. Now, let me tell you something about George Perez, okay, in real life. And that's what I'm going to get into in real life here, right? You go to any comic book convention, right? And George Perez, he's like Space Mountain. He may be one of the oldest rides, but he's got the longest lines. Woo, yeah, I just quoted Ric Flair and stuff like that. And he's such a gentleman, he's such a professional, and he pleases everybody, and he takes that extra step, and they have to give out numbers so the line doesn't get too big, come back, check where your number is. This is not a guy who's really hard to get, he's done conventions for years. He's very accessible, okay? And over 30 years that I know of him going to conventions and stuff, it just gets bigger and bigger with him, right? DC lost him. They brought in Rob Liefeld. He got a couple books. When he did the Deathstroke, I think it was number 0 or something, or retelling the origin, he blatantly reproduced George Perez's, original Teen Titans pages telling the origin. But Perez kind of backed him up and like it was cool, and it was crap. And bringing in Liefeld, one of the guys who is generally got one of the worst reputations in comics, even though he does have a fan base, they turn around and end up making him the voice of reason because the man has his millions of dollars. He doesn't have to sit around and do crap. He doesn't have to sit around and take crap of treating creators like dirt and changing things at the last minute and still expect them to make the deadline on these books they've had planned out and were approved to begin with. And all these things over the years have just come up and stuff. But the one that I saw on YouTube and in real life and people talking about was jerking J.H.H. Williams and his crew off of Batwoman and not letting Batwoman get married. DC has this thing about, we're going to give you diversity, but in this diverse world there are no relationships and nobody can get married and stuff because that's just not hip or whatever. I think it goes back to like the derivatives of the characters so they can get out of paying royalties and stuff like that. And like any Xerox, when you have the original and every time you Xerox it and you Xerox that Xerox and Xerox that Xerox, it gets shittier each time, And yeah, I think I'm on a full-blown rant now. Here we go, man. All right. Now, the thing about DC 52, I mentioned Green Lantern and stuff, and that was actually the book where I was done with the 52. I was optimistic, and I did this book, and I did that book. But I wanted to complete Jeff Johns' Green Lantern run, and I had a whole bunch of them. I need some holes to fill them. I was getting all the Blackest Night, then it went into 52, and I ended up getting issue 1 through 18. I think I had the 0 issue in there, And I read those books, and it all of a sudden the comic books had turned into the mind-numbing crap that people had been saying for 70 years about comics because nothing happened. What where they were in issue 1 is where they were in issue 18, and I could just imagine buying that book monthly. I mean, it blew my mind. I mean, I was really like about to go nuts. I'm like, what happened? They're still in space. Hal still doesn't have a ring. Sinestro's a Green Lantern. What the hell is going on? You know, I was like, this is awful. Nothing happened. And that was the thing about the comics. They were bland. Nothing happened. They were decompressed storytelling. Even when they had long-running weekly comics and stuff like that, they didn't have a payoff and everything. And the proof is in the pudding, man. You can't just go by what is on YouTube and the internet when it comes to comics, because in reality that is such a small portion of the people who collect comics, and you end up finding like-minded people, and you get a mob mentality where everybody's agreeing with what you're saying, and you kind of get the illusion that's how it is everywhere, right? Where I'm at, if you put the center of where I'm at and you go 3 hours and you make a circle around me of anywhere I can go in 3 hours, man, it's Mountain Empire Comic Book Shop, Crit Hit Comic Book Shop, Legion Lost up in Beckley, comic book conventions, Wivicon, Heroes Con, the New River Valley Comic Con, stuff like that, and all these places you go and stuff. They have had tons in real life. They have had tons and tons of DC Comics 52 and Marvel Now books and stuff that they are trying to get rid of at these flea markets too. All kinds of flea. Go back and watch my videos. You know, you know where I've been and stuff. And all of this stuff is not selling. I mean, I don't. That's one part where I'm not sure where it works. Are the comic book stores buying this stuff in bulk because nobody's buying them? They're trying to get rid of them. And what gets me is that they're saying DC is the one in trouble. But I saw a place where it was 3 boxes of DC crap. It was like 6 boxes of Marvel crap. So another thing that confuses me is just a couple months ago that we found out that when they took all the comics, all the revenue of all the comics that had been sold, over the last year and stuff, and thanks to the movies and all this stuff, what got me was, it was creeping up on $1 billion. So I don't know what's going on. I just know that when you have one job to make good comics, and you've got all these creative people, and this is one of the things that Dan Didio has announced that they're going to do to try to solve this $2 million deficit and stuff, is that they're going to lower the page rate, thus paying the creators less, telling them not to do outlandish stuff in their books, and they're going to add more ads to it. And there's no way that the comic book prices are going to go down. That's another thing. And this makes no sense to me, man. What people want, they're so out of touch, or they've got some secret plan, or they're looking for this invisible audience that's not out there. Whatever happened to just making good comic books? That's what people want. It's real simple. It's not. There's no way they don't know this. So I don't know what they're trying to do. And that's the infuriating thing that really gets me. The Emperor has new clothes. I knew we were in trouble when Dan Didio did a video on YouTube. Might have been the DC channel or something like that, where they were talking about convergence and said, now people are finally going to get what they've been asking for. Victorian era Wonder Woman fighting Vampire Joker. Okay, who asked for that? Show me where they asked for that. Raise your hand if you asked for that. And this is what was getting me about DC. I want to wrap this up. I got a lot of things to say. DC was coming out like they were all excited about these books. They're telling us what is supposed to be great, and we're supposed to love it and everything like that. Well, I got news for you. When you're great, you don't have to tell people. They tell you. And I don't think anybody's been telling DC a whole lot in a while. This is coming from a diehard DC fan since I was about 4 years old, going back to 1977. When you're great, you don't have to tell people. There's my rant. I feel better. Maybe there's something in there. Later.